let's talk about the Super Bowl. We saw some really, really interesting things about latency and the delivery of the signal versus the different pathways. And you've got some data on that. So what do you got to share?
Yeah, at least three different charts that I've seen, and it hasn't even been 24 hours since the end of the Super Bowl. The place where I'll start is because just happens to be the first one that I always see. Media analyst and media expert Dan Rayburn
Yep.
always puts out a chart. He has, and Dan, correct me if I'm wrong, but Dan has like a bunch of different streaming devices from Roku's to Fire TVs and Apple TV. He's got every streaming service under the planet, and he evaluates them all. I believe it's from his office. It might be from his home. Maybe they're one and the same. And so it's very unscientific, but it offers really the first insight that we get into things like latency. Dan's a big expert on content delivery networks and streaming latency. And what his chart showed is that and he's comparing this to Fox over the air. I think he's in
Yep.
New York, so that would be Channel 5 in New York. And what he showed was his chart said Tubi, the Fox owned free streaming service, which had the Super Bowl for the first time this year, just a few seconds behind the over the air broadcast. Depending on the platform that he used, it was anywhere from 1 second ahead on iOS using his 5G network, whatever service that is. I haven't actually looked at the blog to see what service he uses. It's
Yep.
probably Verizon. All the way to Tubi on Roku, which had 19 seconds. Tubi as a whole probably averaged maybe, if I'm just kind of doing the math off the top here, maybe about 8 to 12 seconds
Okay.
behind OTA. And then you've got DirecTV Stream, which is 30, and it just grows from there.
And I
Um,
saw YouTube TV, which was 30 plus, although they have this odd little push feature that you can kind of bypass things.
Now, what I haven't seen, and I'm just looking at the chart, is I don't know if he tested DirecTV Stream, Sling, Hulu, YouTube, and Fubo on different services. He's got this whole blog that I haven't had a chance to really dive into.
Well, I'm on
But what
DirecTV satellite, and near as I can figure, tomorrow's Super Bowl game will arrive sometime this afternoon. It
yeah,
is slow bouncing off the bird, dude.
what's interesting about Dan's chart, and the reason why I brought it up first is because there's been at least two others that have come out. One that Rick sent me earlier this morning by email, which also compared Tubi and a bunch of other streaming services to the over-the-air broadcast.
Which is sort of the standard, if not the gold standard. It's what, we're kind of all used to because we can all get it.
That's what
It's
most of
fairly
us
get it.
can, yeah, that's what most of us have to compare to because over the air tends to be the delivery mechanism with the lowest latency.
But let's
Um,
let's make sure we're making this distinction. This is over the air to an antenna,
to an
right
antenna.
to the
That's right.
TV, not over the air through cable, or not over the air certainly through satellite, but
Right.
over the air right on an antenna, which is admittedly a couple seconds behind watching the game in person, but
That's right.
generally not that far behind, right?
So what Dan's study did was he compared over the air with an antenna in the New York market to Tubi and a bunch of other services and found that Tubi came on top. What's interesting to me is that at End Screen Media, Colin Dixon repeated basically the same
Yep.
experiment
From
using
San
the
Francisco.
using the over-the-air Fox owned station in San Francisco and found basically the same thing. But then things get really, really interesting. There is a company called Phoenix, spelled just like the bird, but without an O. And what they do, and I think this is the better way to evaluate latency, is they actually send somebody to the game
Yep.
and have them report back the action that's happening on in real time, and they compare it to a bunch of the streaming services. And what they found was that Tubi was still ahead. Tubi had in their test 26 seconds of latency, which is really not that bad compared to all of the other streaming services. They added NFL Plus in on this too, but what's interesting is that their breakdown by services, by streaming services, even though the seconds are off a little bit because they're comparing it to actual on the field action, having somebody at the game, the way that these streaming services rank in terms of latency are really similar to what Dan and Colin found. So I think if you look at all three of these and you kind of look at them through the same lens, yes, Tubi came out on top. Now, the question is, why did Tubi come out on top? And I think, Rick, you have a couple of thoughts on that.
Well, number one, Tubi can send a direct feed. Admittedly, it's off a bird or it's over broadband. Generally, it used to be on a wire, but they can send a direct feed to, excuse me, Fox can send a direct feed to Tubi. Fox can
Mhm.
send a direct feed to Tubi, which appears to get to Tubi sooner than it gets to broadcast stations.
If it's true that Tubi was just a few seconds at most behind the on the field action, then if you look at the Phoenix chart and they have them, I think, at 26 seconds ahead of or behind the on the field action,
Yep.
that means that over the air was probably around there too. If all of these studies comparing over the air to Tubi have them really, really close, then that means the latency between what happens on the field and over the air, which is still the quickest way to watch real time sports,
We think.
is
Yep.
also about 20 seconds.
Right.
To my theory as to why Tubi had the lowest latency.
Yep.
I don't know if you ever played this game as a kid called Telephone, where uh, you have a message and then you're sitting in like this is played in classrooms a lot. You're sitting in a circle with other classmates and you whisper the message to your next neighbor
Okay.
and they
Yeah.
whisper it to their
Yeah.
neighbor and they whisper it to
Hmm.
their. And the premise of the game is by the end of that chain, usually the message has changed.
Yep.
And what you're probably thinking to yourself is, okay, well, that doesn't really have anything to do with latency, right? Here's where I want you to think of the game in a different sense. The more people you add to that classroom, to that circle, the longer it takes for the message to get from the person who initially said it all the way to the end of the circle. And that just gets longer and longer and longer the more cogs you throw into that
Yeah.
machine,
Yeah,
the more
well.
kids you add to that
Yep.
game. Latency on streaming, same deal. If you're Fox and you're distributing the Super Bowl on Tubi, the feed that was on Tubi was the national feed. And they gussied it up a little bit by adding 4K. It was an upconverted 4K feed, some 4K graphics. So every step along that journey adds a little bit more time before it gets to you, which
Yep.
explains why when you look at the Phoenix chart and it shows 26 seconds between on the field action and how it hit Tubi, that video feed from the field to however they're getting it back to the network, all the computers it has to go through, all the encoding it has to go through, every hop along the way adds a little bit more time.
Yep.
It could be anywhere from a fraction of a second to a full second.
Yep.
We don't know because we don't really know what the process is like. I bet you Dan Rayburn has some thoughts on this. Um, but now when you look at how YouTube TV, Sling TV, DirecTV Stream, DirecTV Satellite, how they get their feeds, they're not getting the national Fox feed, but they would all love to offer it because I've spoken with
Right.
executives that are like, we would love to cut out the local TV guys and just offer the network programming. And they've one of them actually tested this not too long ago. I wrote about it for Stream TV Insider. Every time they have to, that feed goes through a different step and the local TV guys are part of that process. They're getting their feed usually from the network, but sometimes they're getting it from another station.
That's right.
It all depends on where
The
how
deals.
they get that programming.
Yep.
That adds latency. And then by the time they get it out to the consumer, I know as recently as 2 years ago in some markets, YouTube TV to get the local station, they had an antenna farm in some markets and they were just pulling the over the air feed, running it through their CDN, running it through their processes and sending it out to the consumer. So all of that adds extra time. The more steps that video has to go along the
Yep.
way, the
Yep.
longer the journey is.
Yep.
So it doesn't surprise me that Tubi had according to all of these different studies, that Tubi had the shortest amount of latency because they're getting the feed directly from
Correct. The
Fox
direct
Network.
feed.
Now,